All around Europe, but especially in countries of the former Eastern Bloc, there are tens of thousands of prefabricated panel blocks of flats, commie blocks, built from the 1950s all the way to the early 1990s. By the late 90s and early 2000s, cities and individual private owners now started to massively rebuild and upgrade them, wildly, sometimes really, really wildly. Let's take a look at that, while down here in our virtual city of Altengrad, I will be doing exactly those changes to illustrate it. This is the same district as with the tram expansion last episode, and it also happens to be the oldest large prefabricated district, so changes are in order. The prefabricated concrete panel blocks of flats represented, and still do represent for a lot of people, pretty much the entire communist rule in Central Europe in a nutshell. They became the lightning rod of everything wrong back then. The hate mixed together politics, all of modernist city planning, modernist architecture, used materials, the prefabrication technology itself, panel basically became a swear word, and so on and so on. All channeled to hate these poor buildings. That alone is a big motivation for some changes. Right, so that sounds like it led to lots of demolitions. Well, impossible, because millions of people call the prefabs their home, which is simply not going to change. At the same time, some of the prefabs were close to 50 years old by the early 2000s, most on average around 30, since the largest estates are from the 70s. Building standards changed a lot since then. The prefabs no longer met the current building codes, especially when it comes to thermal insulation. Some buildings are also showing not exactly high quality of work, of assembly. Some materials just aged too much. And the privatized residential properties could now be more freely handled by their individual owners, if they decided to spend money on it, if they had it. Private owners were totally free to go for whatever design they chose, skip any architects, designers, or permits. The late 90s, early 2000s are practically the peak of postmodernism in Central Europe, and also the peak of just very colorful and crazy design of everything. In the former communist countries, this explosion of colors was also made much stronger because it was seen as exactly that push against the perceived old communist grayness surrounding cities. Perhaps the super crazy color schemes might also be an indication of the disdain for the prefabs underneath by their owners. Something like, the prefab is totally worthless, zero value worth preserving, so we can do whatever we want, because we literally cannot make it worse. To be fair, these craziest examples don't quite represent the majority. The vast majority of refurbishments would be some one color, possibly 2-3 shade combinations covering the entire facade. Something very common would be absolute disregard for some continuity, because of course uniformity is evil, we have to have it different than our neighbors. But eventually uniformity was achieved, because everybody chose the cheapest styrofoam plaster wall and the white plastic Euro windows, turning the prefabs into even flatter boxes, just with different colors. But usually people chose some similar warm colors, leading to something, at least in Czechia, described as the orange plague. This insulating technology meant it completely covered any previous features, so the decorative stone and panel joints. A lot of prefabs lost their original detailing, likely because it was just a nuisance for the builders and the owners didn't care. These buildings had little round windows at the elevator space. Some facades got rid of those completely. Some covered them but painted them back, like over here. Same with these loggia railing holes, where some buildings just pointlessly flattened it all, paradoxically making the building so much more boring. Quite a lot of owners go for the offer of the construction company to put an advert on their facade, likely for a slight discount. It's a strange practice. Quite obviously the owners don't care much for the visual side if they agree with that, so more often than not, it's the usual generic orange plague below it. The old prefabs sometimes had art on them, good ones actually. The refurbishments covered it, but in some places, mostly in recent years, those art pieces are making a comeback. Sometimes the owners decided to go the extra mile and make the building a little more interesting with maybe a completely new painting or an official graffiti. This is a trend of more recent years when the hate for prefabs kind of cooled down. Another trend started at the turn of the century was extending the panel houses up, basically building a couple of new floors or adding a gable roof. Some of these are just screaming postmodern early 2000s, that urge to deconstruct the plain prefab down below and doing it differently just for the sake of it. But then there is one district in Brno where this was done very seamlessly. Looking at this picture, you probably wouldn't even notice that the entire roof was built much later on top of an ordinary prefab box. Just like that, it looks like an old classic residential building with a traditional gable roof. Then there is Slovakia and a wooden barn on top of a prefab tower. Yeah, normal thing to do, of course. And then there is Poland with this postmodern palace on top of a prefab. It's apparently already demolished. Some refurbishments I actually really like. The Diablice residential estate is considered overall a very good panel estate, if not the best, in Prague. It has custom-built houses that are not seen anywhere else, and clearly it's not a coincidence that owners also refurbished them with just a tiny bit more care, since the houses underneath are already pretty good. A lot of them here did contract the dreaded orange plague, unfortunately, some more than others. But there is one building in particular that I think turned out looking really good. It's also in the orange tones, but much less kindergarten-y, with very logical accents, but most of all, this is probably the only prefab in the country where the new plastic window frames are not white, but brown, and it just works so well with the facade. Also, loggia railings have that red glass square, which is actually restored original decoration. All the prefabs here retained that as well. East Germany is an outlier, again and again. Due to the exodus of population to the west, Germans did not see the trend of extending the prefabs, but on the other hand removed a couple of floors, sometimes all of them. I will probably return to that in some other videos, but the remaining ones they did refurbish. But they did it in the usual German fashion of not going all that crazy, being a lot more realistic about it, and here and there using much more expensive techniques than further east. Here in almost downtown Dresden, these very old types just received a very tame new coat, very uniform as well. The newer ones further to the outskirts too, with some balcony details. The towers have decorative tiles, some were even covered in climbing vines. This building over here, a linear section near the city center, so visible a lot, has very unique tiles with different shapes and colors, which is a huge difference from what we saw before in the other countries. But Germans can get really crazy, like with this one, although it's not that random, cheap craziness, but very fancy one. With Hungary, there is not much to say, because Hungarians actually largely do not refurbish the prefabs, perhaps due to slightly warmer climate, money maybe plays a role as well, but the ones they did insulate follow pretty much the same styles as in Poland, Czechia or Slovakia. So those were some of the things done to the old concrete panel blocks of flats in Central Europe. The approaches followed some common motivation, but as you saw, the executions were all over the place. It perfectly illustrated the newly free societal environment to change city visuals as the individual owners pleased, which of course opens the question if that's how it should be. But nevertheless, today it's already a historical phase in the evolution of cities that was not random but had some background. Let's now take a look at our city. This episode had to happen in the Altengrad series because if we are talking about prefabs, the concrete panel blocks of flats in Central Europe, then obviously I must cover these crazy colorful refurbishments, or just the refurbishments in general. As we saw, not all of them were that crazy. But how to do it in city skylines, because these buildings are obviously not in the workshop. Most of the prefabs, or like 99% of the prefabs in the workshop, are the old versions. There are a couple of the more colorful ones, but I obviously need to show the progression. So how to adapt the ones that I already have into these new versions? Well, I had to make them on my own. Now, these G57 prefabs, that's by the way why I chose this location, because these are the prefabs that I made in Blender. Those are my models. So I already had the Blender files and everything, so it was easy to adapt it, or at least, it would be easier. But the process was not easy. I think I covered the entire process in like a minute in the time-lapse in the beginning of today's video, but believe me, it took a couple of weeks actually. So yeah, it was not fast at all because, I was just experimenting. I was not exactly sure what I'm doing at first and how I'm going to approach it. Now, in the end, I made these codes for the buildings. By the way, each version of this building does have its own code. So, that was time consuming on its own. And these codes are super simple. It's just a couple of vertices because the windows are made with the alpha map. So it's kind of optimized, when it comes to vertices. But unfortunately, it's not optimized when it comes to the texture because all the walls, every single wall is basically a single face. So it's not tiled or anything like that. I think you've seen that in the time lapse. Now the reason for that is so that I can do these kinds of images on the facades, like for example over here. And vast majority, if not all actually, well, yeah, all of them, because I only made one version, the sort of like a sun with those orange colors. I'm not actually sure if I used it now that I think about it, but all the rest of these textures are actually made by my community. So you guys were really nice. I just posted the instructions how to paint your own facade, and we were just streaming and playing, building Altengrad, and you guys were in the background just making all of these in the meantime. So I could have just used them in the city. That was so great. That was such a nice experience. I thank you so much, everyone who participated in this. And you guys were super creative. Lots of these, if not all of these, are actually inspired by real life. So these kinds of crazy colored schemes, you could have seen, actually, I showed some of them in those pictures from real life. So yeah, now we have them in Altengrad. Now, obviously, it's not the entire city, and it's not even this entire district done like this, because that would be just way too time consuming. So I eventually decided, and you can kind of see that here in these cinematics, that I'm only going to do a couple of things here and there, and I'm mostly going to focus on like smaller areas. Those I'm going to refurbish slightly more, so even add new playgrounds, new parking lots, these kinds of changes as they were happening in real life. And I'm just going to do that in some small places. So I'm going to completely skip all the rest of the blocks of flats areas in the city because it would just take such a long time. I think building for this entire episode took a couple of weeks, or everything surrounding this episode took a couple of weeks. So yeah, even though it's kind of a short video, then still it was a lot of work. With this particular prefab in here, I decided to illustrate that extension up. With this one, I think it turned out looking all right. It's definitely not something super over the top, as we could have seen in some of those pictures. I even extended the elevators all the way to the new floors, which is usually not done, actually. So yeah, this is not a bad building. The rainbows, obviously, just as we saw them in Poland, and a couple of more timid ones from Germany, inspired from Germany. Of course, the sun on the green facade. Oh yeah, that's very, very nice. Now, I also did some refurbishments to some of the Meistermonis's towers. I just tried to do it for someone else's buildings, and it was a very lengthy process to adapt it, so, I'm just not going to do it in the rest of the city. And like I said, I only did it here to illustrate it, but we just have to use our imagination and imagine the rest of Altengrad going through similar changes. But seriously, in City Skylines, it's just so much work. But that is now going to be all for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching it. If you liked it, then you know the drill, what to do below the video, clicking, writing, subscribing, sharing. And huge thanks to the channel members who are directly supporting me in what I'm doing in here. So thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate your support. Take care. Goodbye.